Welcome back to Notes of Curiosity, exploring ideas that matter. I'm Alex, and with me today is Eve, and we are diving deep into Nexus, a brief history of information networks, from the Stone Age to AI, by Yuval Noah Harari.
And if that name, Yuval Noah Harari, sounds familiar, it's probably because you've read Sapiens or Homo Deus, two of his other bestsellers.
Huge bestsellers.
Huge bestsellers, yeah. So he is a historian with a real knack for tackling big ideas.
Yeah.
In this book, he's taking on information networks, how they shaped our past and how they might shape our future.
Information networks. So, okay, I have to admit, when I first picked up this book, I was like, information networks, is that just like the internet and stuff?
Yeah.
But then you start reading and you realize, oh, it goes way, way back.
Oh, yeah.
The very beginning.
He takes us right back to the very beginnings of humanity.
Yeah.
And he really kind of rewrites a lot of what we think about why humans are so successful. It's not just about, our intelligence or our, individual capabilities. It's our ability to cooperate in large numbers.
Right.
To connect and to do that through shared information. And this is where he gets really interesting because his definition of information is very, very broad.
Okay.
I mean, he says in the book, we can consider as information anything that can influence the behavior of a sentient being.
Okay, so it's not just hard facts or data.
Not at all.
It's anything that can change the way we act or the way we think.
Anything that can change, how we behave in the world. And this is where he gets, I think, really clever because he points out that information networks don't necessarily need to rely on truth.
Okay.
In fact, he starts the book with this amazing story about a spy ring in World War I called Nili.
Okay.
And this group risked their lives to send intelligence to the British about the Ottoman Empire. And this tiny little network, sending messages. Sometimes a single carrier pigeon carrying this message might have saved countless lives and even contributed to the eventual founding of Israel.
Wow.
It's this really powerful example of how even a small piece of information can have these massive world-changing consequences.
But then, in the very next chapter, you go from this incredible story of, heroism and espionage, and he takes you to something completely different.
Totally different.
He's talking about the business of astrology.
Yeah, like, your horoscope.
Yeah. Like what? And he says, in 2020, the global market for astrological consultations was worth an estimated $2.2 billion.
I mean, that's a lot of horoscopes.
That is a lot of people reading their horoscopes, like, every day.
All day. Yeah.
And it makes you think, why are we so willing to accept this information from horoscopes, which, have no basis in reality, while other information like that message from the carrier pigeon just gets ignored or dismissed?
And I think that's exactly the question he wants us to ask. Why is that? And he really leads us to this idea that our need to connect, our need to find meaning in the world can sometimes be stronger than our need for, truth or objectivity.
Right. It's almost like we crave that connection more than we crave the truth sometimes.
And that need for connection, that need for meaning, he argues that leads us to the first major information technology, stories.
Stories.
I mean, think about it. Long before writing, humans were sharing information through myths, legends, gossip.
Right.
And these stories, they weren't just entertainment.
Yeah.
They helped us make sense of the world, understand our place in it. They helped us build communities. And crucially, they helped us cooperate on a scale that no other animal could match.
And he gives a really powerful example of this. He talks about the poem In the City of Slaughter by Haim Naman Bialik.
Oh, yeah.
Written in response to a pogrom in Kishinev in 1903. And he talks about how this poem, it didn't just describe the horror of the event, it became this rallying cry that fueled, Zionist sentiments and eventually contributed to the formation of Israel's military forces.
So stories are powerful.
They can shape the course of history.
They really can.
Yeah. So from stories, we move on to writing.
Which is kind of, the next big leap in information technology, in Harari's view anyway. And he argues that, writing addressed some of the limitations of storytelling, of oral storytelling.
Because you could store information more reliably. You could send it across greater distances.
You could have it for future generations.
Future generations.
It was a game changer.
Yeah.
And this is where we get into bureaucracy.
Yeah. Which, let's be honest, does not always have the best reputation.
No, it does not. But it's fascinating because Harari recognizes that. He says bureaucracy is based on the assumption that it is always better to have too much information than not enough.
Right.
But this need for information, this need to categorize everything, put it in these neat little boxes,
Right.
can actually lead to some real problems.
Like when you're filling out a form online.
Exactly.
And you're like, wait a minute, none of these boxes actually describe my situation.
Like, how do I fit into this?
Yeah.
And he uses this really clever example of the Linnaean system of taxonomy, which, tries to classify all living organisms into these neat categories.
Right.
But he points out nature doesn't always play by those rules.
It's messy.
Like, you've got things like ring species where, neighboring populations can interbreed, but then you get to the end of the ring and they can't.
Where do you even draw the line?
Here's the dividing line. It gets really messy.
Right.
So even in science, our attempts to kind of impose this order on the world can sometimes actually distort the truth a little bit.
Yeah.
And this tension between order and complexity gets even more interesting, I think, as writing moves from being associated with, divine authority and kind of, the realm of priests and temples to being used for more secular purposes, like government and trade.
Yeah, and you see that shift happening. You look at ancient law codes like the Code of Hammurabi.
Yeah.
Writing allowed rulers to codify their laws, make them more permanent, more widespread.
And it changed religion, dramatically.
Yeah.
Harari talks about the Hebrew Bible and the way that it went through this long process of canonization. It wasn't just, a case of divine revelation.
Right.
Humans had to make choices.
Right.
Which text to include, which to leave out.
Which means there is no single definitive version.
Exactly. There are many versions, and they've evolved over time. So even something that seems, sacred, like a religious text,
Right.
ultimately it's shaped by human decisions, human interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
And as we kind of move into this early modern period, we see the emergence of, scientific journals,
Right.
scientific society.
Like the Royal Society.
Like the Royal Society. And these institutions start to establish a new standard for knowledge. They're moving away from just relying on tradition or authority figures.
Right.
They're looking for empirical evidence, peer review.
Right. So observable, verifiable evidence, basically.
Yeah. But it's interesting because alongside this rise of scientific thinking, you also have things like the witch hunts.
Right, which were just fueled by paranoia and superstition.
Outright fabrications sometimes.
Yeah, and that's kind of scary. So you have this rise of scientific thinking, but at the same time, you still have these older ways of thinking.
And they coexist,
And they clash sometimes.
Yeah, in a big way. And he illustrates this clash, I think, really brilliantly with this story of Dan Shechtman, who discovered quasicrystals in the 1980s.
Okay, quasicrystals, tell me more.
And he was ridiculed.
Really?
By the scientific community at the time. Even a Nobel laureate, Linus Pauling, came out against him.
Wow.
But he stuck to his guns. He had the data to back it up.
Yeah, the evidence.
He had the evidence, and the scientific community eventually had to accept that they were wrong.
And they did, eventually, right?
Yeah, he won a Nobel Prize in 2011 for his discovery.
So he gets the last laugh. That's a great example of how scientific networks, while not perfect, they can self-correct.
They can change their minds.
When they're presented with compelling evidence.
When they're faced with the facts.
Right. And that's kind of encouraging.
It is, in a way.
So we've gone from, stories around the campfire to scientific journals. What happens when we bring the digital age into this whole story of information networks?
That's where things get really, really interesting because in the second part of the book, Harari, he kind of shifts his focus to the digital age, the rise of artificial intelligence, and he argues that we're seeing these new information networks emerge that are both similar to and totally different from anything that's come before.
Yeah, it's a whole new world.
Yeah.
And one of the concepts that really struck me was this idea of dataism.
Yeah.
What is dataism?
Dataism. So Harari describes it as almost like he calls it a new religion that's emerging in the 21st century. And he writes that dataism declares that the universe consists of data flows, and the value of any phenomenon or entity is determined by its contribution to data processing.
So instead of worshiping gods or money, we're worshiping data.
Data is becoming the ultimate source of meaning.
It sounds a little dystopian, doesn't it?
It can. I mean, you think about how much of our lives are now mediated through data.
Right.
Everything we do online, our shopping habits, our social interactions, all of it's being tracked, it's being analyzed.
Right.
And that data is being used to target us with ads.
Right.
To shape our news feeds, even to predict our behavior.
And it's not just big tech companies.
No.
Governments are using this data too, right?
Governments, absolutely, to monitor their citizens, to control the flow of information, to exert their power.
And this is where AI comes in.
This is where AI becomes, really important because Harari argues that AI is accelerating all of these trends.
Okay.
He says, AI is likely to create unprecedented concentrations of power in the hands of a small elite. Right.
And he points to, places like China, where the government is using AI to build this vast surveillance state.
It's kind of, unnerving to think about how much power these algorithms have over our lives.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider that, often we don't even understand how they work.
That's the scary part, this black box problem of AI. Even the people who create these algorithms often can't fully explain, why they make the decisions they do.
Right.
He gives this fascinating example of AlphaGo, the AI program that beat the world champion Go player Lee Sedol back in 2016.
I remember that, yeah.
It was a big deal.
It was.
And what was so interesting about that match was that AlphaGo made this move.
Okay.
During the game, it's called Move 37.
Okay.
And it was this completely unexpected move.
Okay.
It just defied all traditional Go strategy. And even the program's creators couldn't really explain why it had made this move. But it turned out to be this brilliant move, a pivotal moment in the match that led to AlphaGo's victory. So even the people who were designing these AI systems, the best minds in the field, they're still surprised sometimes by what they can do.
It's both exciting and a little unsettling.
Yeah, because it raises all these questions about control and accountability.
Right.
If we don't understand how these algorithms work, how can we make sure that they're being used ethically, responsibly?
And how can we hold anyone accountable if something goes wrong?
Right. It's not just about the data itself. It's about, who controls that data and how it's being used.
Who has the power? Who's making the decisions?
There's a lot at stake here.
Harari definitely thinks so. He argues that, AI has this potential to both empower us and to enslave us.
Okay.
It could lead to this future where, humans are augmented by AI. We live longer, healthier, more fulfilling lives. Or it could lead to a future where we're controlled by algorithms,
Right.
Our choices are limited. Our privacy is completely eroded.
So how do we avoid that dystopian future? What does Harari suggest?
Well, he doesn't offer, easy answers.
Okay.
But he emphasizes the importance of critical thinking, of being aware of the potential risks of AI, of demanding transparency and accountability from, the people who are developing these technologies.
So it's not about rejecting technology altogether.
Yeah.
It's about being informed,
Absolutely.
engaged.
Making sure that we're shaping these technologies in a way that actually benefits humanity.
And he says something really interesting about this. He says, the real question facing us is not what will happen to us, but what do we want to become?
It's a good question.
A really good question, yeah. So he's challenging us to take responsibility for this future that we're creating.
Take control of the narrative. Don't just let it happen to us. And then he brings up this whole other aspect, which is this global race for AI dominance.
Right, between the U.S. and China primarily.
Exactly. It's this, competition that's playing out on the world stage.
Yeah.
And he connects it back to, historical events like the Industrial Revolution, China's century of humiliation. And he highlights how these technological advancements, they always have these, profound geopolitical consequences.
And it's so interesting how he uses this, what seems like a trivial example, to illustrate this point. He talks about all those cat pictures online.
Right. Those millions of cat pictures that people were sharing, they weren't just these cute distractions.
Right.
They became this valuable data.
Data, yeah.
That helped to train powerful image recognition algorithms.
Algorithms that are now being used for everything.
From self-driving cars to facial recognition technology.
It's kind of amazing to think about.
It's this reminder that, what seems like a harmless online trend can have these, really unexpected consequences.
And even our leisure activities can be fueling these technological developments, with huge implications.
Exactly. And it leads to this, I think, crucial question that he asks in the book. Can artificial intelligence actually surpass human stupidity?
That's a big question. Is he saying that, AI could be our downfall?
Well, not necessarily, but he's highlighting this paradox. We're creating these incredibly sophisticated machines, capable of learning, problem solving on a level that we've never seen before.
Right.
But at the same time, we humans, We make these decisions that are irrational, short-sighted, sometimes even self-destructive.
So he's asking us to kind of look in the mirror,
Exactly.
to examine our own biases and limitations as we're developing these powerful new technologies.
Yeah.
So we've got this tension, this real tension between this incredible potential of AI and, our own human fallibility. How do we even navigate that? Where do we go from here?
Well, Harari, he doesn't give us, a simple roadmap. He actually emphasizes that the future is not predetermined. He sees this moment as kind of a critical juncture, a real turning point. He writes, "We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens. Within a century or two, Earth will be dominated by entities that are more different from us than we are from Neanderthals."
Okay, that's a pretty intense statement.
Yeah.
Is he saying that humans are, going extinct?
Not necessarily extinct, but certainly, transformed.
Okay.
He really believes that AI, biotechnology, all of these things are going to fundamentally change what it means to be human.
Hmm.
We might merge with machines, we might enhance our cognitive abilities, we might even create entirely new forms of life.
It sounds like, something out of science fiction.
It does, doesn't it? But Harari argues that these possibilities are a lot closer than we think.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the advances in, gene editing, brain-computer interfaces, it's moving really, really fast.
It's a lot to process,
Yeah.
So if the future is so uncertain, what can we do? How can we even prepare for this world where AI is so powerful?
Well, he suggests that we need to focus on developing what he calls mental flexibility and emotional intelligence.
Okay.
He says, in order to stay relevant, to keep up with the algorithms, you will need to reinvent yourself again and again and faster and faster.
So in this world, it's changing so quickly. The ability to adapt,
To learn new skills?
to manage our emotions, that
Right.
becomes crucial.
It really does.
Okay, that makes sense. We need to be lifelong learners.
We do, but it's like, how do we cultivate those qualities in a world that's becoming increasingly, dominated by technology?
Right.
And he doesn't have all the answers, but he does suggest that things like, meditation, mindfulness,
Okay.
these practices can help us to develop, greater self-awareness, emotional resilience. He also talks about the importance of human connection, building strong relationships, strong communities that can support us through all of this change.
So it's not just about upgrading our technology, it's about upgrading ourselves, our inner software, so to speak.
Yeah, the human operating system. He says, if you want to keep up with the world of 2050, then get in the habit of constantly learning and reinventing yourself. He believes that, our ability to adapt, to learn, and to connect with each other, that's going to be more important than ever before.
Yeah. There's a lot to take in here, but I think Harari's book really does offer this valuable perspective, this lens on the challenges, on the opportunities that are ahead of us, and it's a reminder that the future, it's not just something that happens to us.
Right.
We create it.
Through our choices.
Through our actions.
Through our willingness to kind of embrace the unknown.
Right. Embrace change. And I think one of the most profound insights that he offers in the book is this. We need to be careful not to get so obsessed with information, with data,
Yeah.
that we lose sight of what really matters.
Yeah.
Our values, our relationships, our sense of purpose. He writes, information is useless if it doesn't lead to action.
So it's not enough to just be informed. We've got to use that information to do something, to make a difference in the world.
To create a better world, hopefully.
Exactly. And that's maybe the biggest takeaway from this deep dive into Nexus. Information is powerful, but ultimately it's up to us to decide how we use it.
To shape that future, we need to be mindful.
Adaptable.
And above all, human.
Human.
And that's it for our deep dive into Yuval Noah Harari's Nexus, a brief history of information networks from the Stone Age to AI.
This is Alex and Eve.
Until next time, keep those notes of curiosity flowing.